Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I have a rather lengthy written testimony that I'd like just to be made part of the record.
Without objection.
As you're aware, the government of Syria continues to carry out a pattern of gross violations of human rights despite its promises to stop. As Secretary Clinton said yesterday, from the U.S. perspective, President Assad has lost legitimacy. She said President Assad is not indispensable, and we have absolutely nothing invested in his remaining in power. Our goal is to see that the will of the Syrian people for a democratic transformation occurs. I want to give a little background on the what's gotten us to this point and where we are today in trying to move forward with respect to Syria. A little bit on the background. As you know, the large-scale demonstrations started in mid-March in the southern town of Daria, which you just mentioned. Security forces fired on demonstrators calling for the release of children who had been held for weeks for writing political graffiti on walls. This brutal act sparked a collective will by the Syrian people who've been oppressed for decades. In response, thousands, tens of thousands of average Syrians organized peaceful demonstrations on the streets of towns, villages, and cities across Syria, which are now entering their fourth month. President Assad and his regime have responded to these peaceful protests with gunfire, mass arrests, torture, and abuse. Human rights organizations report that over 1,300, perhaps as many as 1,600 Syrians have been killed. Thousands more have been jailed, and Syrian people are being held hostage to a widening crackdown by security forces. But the Syrian people remarkably have lost their fear. They're not backing down. In the face of this brutality, they're continuing to take to the streets to demand freedom, respect for their basic rights, transition to democracy, and for dignity. Syrian military security forces have besieged communities, cut off water, cut off the internet, conducted mass arrests without due process, targeted emergency medical responders, shot peaceful protesters. I'd also note that our reports are that about 200 Syrian soldiers have been killed. We regret and condemn the loss of their lives too, but the vast majority of the casualties have been unarmed civilians. By continuing to ban foreign journalists and observers, the regime seeks to hide these basic facts. Because the government has banned independent media, crimes committed by government forces have been reported mainly through images and videos taken by brave demonstrators and smuggled out of the country. Last week, President Assad sacked the governor of Hama and ordered his troops and tanks to surround the city, where they still are. At least 10,000 Syrians and perhaps many more perished at the hands of his father in 1982. And yet, despite the city's tragic history and despite numerous provocations, the demonstrators in Hama have remained unbelievably peaceful. As you know, last week, and as you said, Ambassador Ford visited Hama, where there have been 6 weeks of demonstrations. He toured the city. He reported that protesters were peaceful. There are no attacks on government buildings or officials. However, the government continues to carry out sweeps. It's arrested dozens of peaceful demonstrators without judicial authority, and these roundups are contrary to President Assad's promises that proper procedures will be used. His ambassador's travel to Hama is a demonstration of our solidarity with the people of that city, for their right to demonstrate and assemble, and for their continued demand for a more democratic future for Syria. While the Syrian government again today accused us of gross interference in Syrian affairs, the ambassador was greeted with flowers and cheered by city residents, and we continue to stand behind the people of Syria and their demand for a more just and open society. Yesterday, as you know, a mob attacked our embassy and the French embassy. They threw rocks, they smashed windows, they raised the Syrian flag. they scrawled graffiti calling Ambassador Ford a dog. We were able to restore order to the Marine Guards, and we've strongly condemned this violation of diplomatic protocol. We view these incidents as further evidence that President Assad's government continues to be the real source of instability in Syria. He's promised reforms, but he's delivered no meaningful changes. He talks about dialogue, but he continues to engage in violence that prove his rhetoric hollow. Amnesty International has reported that killings and torture by security forces in the towns of Tel Khalil and on the Lebanese border in May resulted in scores of people being hurt, some elderly, some under 18 years old. Detainees were interviewed by Amnesty in Lebanon, and they described, as many others have, brutal torture, including beatings, prolonged use of stress positions, use of electric shock, etc. So the situation remains grim. It's a situation which, among other things, we receive numerous reports of attacks on children, perhaps the best known, a 13-year-old Hamzi al-Khatib, whose torture and mutilated body was returned to his family by Syrian security forces in late April. The United States has repeatedly raised our concerns. As you said, Mr. Chairman, we're very proud of Ambassador Ford's presence there. Since he's arrived on the scene, he's raised individual cases of political prisoners, some of whom have been released, but we remain deeply concerned about the treatment of the thousands of detainees who remain in custody. As you know, we've imposed sanctions, and I'm glad to speak about that if you have questions. We've also been involved and continue to be involved both at the UN Human Rights Council and now in New York in trying to fashion an appropriate response in the UN Security Council. I would end just by saying that we're clear that since the protests began, this is about the Syrian people and their desire to shape a new destiny. There are growing signs that civil society and opposition groups, both inside and outside Syria, are becoming more organized. A peaceful democratic transition will require the participation of and respect for all of Syria's ethnic and religious groups. We want to see a Syria that's unified, where tolerance and equality are the norm. The Syrian people have shown that they will not cease their demands for dignity and a future free from intimidation and fear. The Syrian people deserve a government that respects its own people, works to build a more stable and prosperous country, and does not rely on repression at home or antagonism abroad to maintain its grip on power. They deserve a government that serves them. That would be good for Syria, good for the region, and good for the world. In the meantime, the United States government will continue to press for an immediate end to the violence and the beginning of a democratic, peaceful process. It's important for the United States that the Syrian people succeed in this endeavor, and we're going to support their efforts to bring a peaceful and prosperous future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your strong statement, and we also appreciate the statement of Secretary Clinton yesterday as well. You mentioned that it's been very difficult to get information out of Syria to the rest of the world, and I guess my first question is that are there additional things that the United States can do or the international community can do to provide assistance to kind of circumvent the regime's censors in order to help activists be able to better broadcast information about the violation of civil and human rights, so that the world can see more clearly the brutality of what's happening there?
I think that a couple of things are important. One is that we maintain our embassy's presence. It's for us, our eyes and ears are through Ambassador Ford and his staff, and they're doing an extraordinary job in a difficult circumstance. Secondly, I think it's important that we continue to support an open internet. Syrians, like many people in the Middle East and around the world now, activists are using these new technologies to communicate with each other and with the world. And some of what we've been doing and are doing to support internet freedom, I think, is an important piece of this. I think we need to keep pressing our allies and other governments, both in the region and elsewhere, to continue pushing for greater access for journalists and for others to be able to come in and out of the country, because it still is a very controlled environment, and journalists don't have the access they need to help tell the story.
As I mentioned at the beginning, as you mentioned in your statement, we commend our ambassadors showing up and witnessing firsthand some of the peaceful protests that are going on. Let me just ask you a question about kind of the ability of the embassy to be able to interact with the Syrian government during this difficult time. I mean, does the ambassador have access to the president, to President Assad? Who, if there are people that are disappeared and we're trying to raise the issue, is the Syrian government, listening to, giving us the ability to be able to communicate that, or have we been cut off at this point?
I think the answer to that is that Ambassador Ford has on occasion been able to meet with President Assad, but he certainly met with people and does meet with people in the government and in the President's office on a regular basis. Whether they listen to him is another question, but one of the things that's I spoke with him yesterday morning, and one of the things that's quite clear is the constant raising of specific cases which he's doing, including some elderly prisoners and others with humanitarian needs, has had an impact. He was very adamant and very persistent in pushing for the June 27th meeting of the opposition, which in the end was permitted to take place. I think the ambassador played a role in that. And again, visits like the visit to Hama last week send a signal to the Syrian people that we understand their plight and that we stand beside them and behind them as they try to demonstrate peacefully for a democratic transition.
Do we have any reason to believe that within the government that there's varying points of view and some concern over the tactics of the security forces? I mean, is there, or, I mean, do we see that there are some people that are beginning to, who have been associated with President Assad, who are beginning to rethink their position or express concern that maybe they're going down the wrong road here?
I think no government is a monolith, and our assumption is, I can't give you chapter and verse, but our assumption is that what in April or even May people may have assumed was a short-lived resistance or protest movement has now evolved into something much more significant. If you look at the map and you see the various dots on that map, those are all the places all over the country where people have demonstrated. This is not just happening in one sector, one corner of the country. And so I would imagine if people are reality testing in the Syrian government, they're beginning to realize that this is a widespread movement representing deep dissatisfaction with the way the government's operated for a long time, and that it is not about to abate. And so my estimate would be that there are those discussions going on with the government.
And amongst the Syrian people, do we believe that that everybody knows what's going on? I mean, do we think that the Syrian people, by and large, as a group, understand the brutality of their government? Do they, or are there any differences along ethnic or sectarian or geographic or class lines in terms of how the people are responding to what's unfolding?